So what you see in all of the webinars is a result of all of our thinking about what it is that you might be interested in and needed to know. And I also want to thank Board Effect for sponsoring this particular webinar. Board Effect works with nonprofits of all kinds, but particularly hospitals, foundations, educational institutions, and others, and government entities, to put board books online and advance the work of governing bodies, thus elevating organizational performance. So thank you very much to BoardSource. And I'd like to introduce our panelists now. The first is Vernetta Walker, who is Vice President of Programs and the Chief Governance Officer for BoardSource. Welcome, Vernetta.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Tim Wolfred is an independent consultant to nonprofits in executive transitions. He for a long time was with Compass Point, and Vernetta wanted me to be sure to say that Tim is one of the founding, long-standing group of consultants in this country who have paid attention to and developed materials for nonprofit executive transitions over what, Tim, about the past 20 years, right?
About that, yes. Thank you. Very generous introduction. Thank you.
Karen Gaskins-Jones, who is a principal at JLH Associates, who provide training and consultancy. So again, this webinar is the last on the topic of executive transitions and succession planning. And our focus today will be primarily on the board's role, but it will talk about the role of others as well. So if you're here and you're a staff person or an executive director, you're going to find something in what we say that you're going to want to pay attention to. Succession planning in an organization is really everybody's business. So I want to talk for a minute about, just very quickly, about a recent study that was done, which will bring home the importance of this. And then I'm going to ask the panelists to bring it home in their own way as well. Leadership, the Third Sector New England recently did a study called Leadership New England, Essential Shifts for a Thriving Nonprofit Sector. And in that, they talked about the fact it's a very interesting study, and it is up on their site, and also on, we have a link to it on our site. But it's an interesting study in that they interviewed and surveyed a lot of board members and nonprofit execs. And when they interviewed the nonprofit execs, they asked them what was the condition of the organization when they entered the organization. A full 23% of the execs said that they entered the organization in a turnaround situation. That is pretty scary. That was it was even a little bit more than the execs that said that they had entered into a stable organization. So what we're going to talk about today primarily is what it is that would make an organization basically attractive to the best kind of leadership, and what makes it robust enough to survive even through leadership transitions, whether they be planned or inadvertent. So I'm going to ask can we move on to the next slide? Anya? Okay. This slide says, change is always with us, leaders are not. And at this point, all three of the panelists are going to tell a short story about experiences that they've had or have observed where an inadvertent transition took place. So can we go first to Tim?
Yes. Thank you, Ruth. Well, this, in a sense, is an illustration of an organization that was totally unprepared for the departure of its executive. It's an organization that social service organization, $12 million in budget, being led by a 35-year founder, who the organization in the last 3 to 4 years had fallen into somewhat of a decline. He had been very successful, was quite renowned, but they were coming into financial troubles and some staffing problems. The board negotiated with him very respectfully to retire within the year. They began a search, and they began looking more closely at the organization to discover that the management team, for instance, had 3 empty positions on it, one including the CFO position. The organization was in debt. The board itself had shrunk to 7 people, all of whom had been on the board for at least 15 years. There was no deputy who was clearly qualified to step up. They just were totally unprepared, and the board was unprepared to offer a competitive salary. They didn't realize how much they needed to raise the salary of the executive in order to draw talent. They did a search. No good talent came forward, so they ended up promoting one of the deputies who, after 6 months, was asked to resign, and they had to begin and really redo the search and get into some solid capacity building before they could begin really drawing the talent they needed. It's just an example of what often happens with long-term executives. The board and organization is just not prepared for that departure or of that person around whom the organization is so tightly wrapped.
Right. And how about you, Vernetta, or Karen, how about you next?
Well, in my example, the board was taken by surprise, but it was something that was totally unexpected. And a local nonprofit, which was rather small, but did development work within the community. The executive director was out doing her morning run and, having just celebrated her 40th birthday, was hit by a car and died. I was in the midst of doing strategic planning with them, and fortunately, she had begun to think about bench strength in her organization, and rather than having the typical hierarchy of people reporting to her, she began to develop a paradigm where there would be overlapping responsibilities. Unfortunately, her unexpected death caused the board to deal with an executive transition, and the paradigm that she began with them allowed us to identify who could act in a certain way during an interim period while a new search for an executive was going on. So that capacity building is always important, I think, for an organization, and sometimes, passing the baton forward doesn't always happen in a planned way. So we need to be proactive and intentional.
Right. Vernetta?
Thank you. So my story is very short. I love the tales of being proactive and intentional, but my experience was with a board that was in complete denial. The founder was the CEO, and it was a small organization, and I was first contacted by the CEO, and he said he had already informed his board that he was planning to leave, and he wanted the board and the organization to be very thoughtful about succession planning, and at the time we offered succession and executive transition services. So he says, you should get a phone call from my board chair. He called me back a month later. I said, no contact, but we're here, we're ready. A month after that, I got a phone call from the CEO. Still nothing had happened. The third month, he says, well, I'm sure you'll hear from him now because I'm leaving. And, in fact, I'm relocating. I've left the keys on the desk, and, I left them a letter. And I couldn't believe it because for a couple of months, he really did give plenty of notice. But at the end of the day, this was a board that felt that if they didn't take any action, that he would not leave. He wouldn't be allowed to leave. So they felt that that was their control over that founder, that we won't do anything, so you have to stay here and keep this entity going. And, well, that wasn't the case because he left.
Right. So this brings us, thank you so much for those stories. I'm amazed, Karen, at how similar your story is to one that I experienced where an older leader, and she was actually in her 60s, had kind of mentored 3 women in this community organization over a period of like probably 25 years. And it was a very tight group, but she had always had very tight control on the reins of the organization, and she kind of started to slip a little bit. And those 3 women stepped up around her like nobody's business. They eventually helped her out of the organization. But what was amazing about it was that they basically had all of the contacts and the relationships because they had traveled with her through all of her leadership duties, and so they understood what it was that they were looking at, and all of those little nuances that we have inside of our organizations that are so incredibly important, the protocols, the strange funding quirks, and all of that. So I want to go to this slide that we have in front of us now, which looks it includes in the kind of bundle of things that need to be paid attention to in developing a really robust organization, the culture of the organization, which, as any of us know, can chew somebody up and spit them out faster than just about anything else in the world. So understanding how the culture is built inside of the organization to accept or reject new leadership and the development of co-leadership, all of that is incredibly important. The sense of strategy inside of the organization, its ability to see into the future and to understand how its current business plan meets that future in a way that can kind of keep pace. The resources, and again, going back to that New England, the third sector New England study, this was the area that the entering nonprofits said this was the place where they had the most problems, was that they weren't told early about impending resource problems or resource problems that were already current. And then leadership, where we are going to spend a lot of time today on the issue of leadership. Before we move on, I do want to say you all on the bottom right-hand side of your screen have a place where you can enter questions. The panel is going to do some presentations, but we're going to leave a little time for questions at the end. And so please feel free to enter your questions in there, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So I want to go to Karen now and ask her to talk a little bit about both the part of succession planning that is about developing a deep leadership bench and the part that has to do with developing a good, strong emergency plan. So take it away, Karen. And can we move to the next slide, Anya?
Thank you so much, Ruth. I enjoyed very much being a part of a cadre of consultants that work with both Tim Wolfred and Tom Adams in developing transition management and succession planning models that we have passed throughout the United States. And so when you think about really building an organization well, it is about thinking about the future in really meaningful ways, regardless of the size. I really liked your original slide that talked about, change is there always, but leaders are not. So every organization needs to prepare for some sort of movement of their staff, because leadership is not just about positional authority. Anyone can lead from wherever they are. So when you think about how do you keep deep pools of talent where there is enough redundancy in order for the organization to perform its mission and achieve its goals, then there should be a lot of cross-training that goes on regardless of the kind of size. And that can be done strategically and in the long term, and you always want to make sure that for unexpected sorry. Like in my particular story, you want to make sure that there's someone who can step up, if you would, to really take on that role, at least in a temporary fashion, before people move on. So when you think about transition management, normally think about the leader at the top of the organization is moving forward. However, anybody within the organization who is in a key position needs to have some sort of process by which to have a good ending and the new person coming in to have a great beginning. So, Anya, could you give us the next slide, please? So, no matter whether you have a longer term kind of focus or a shorter term focus, so far as being prepared for an emergency, you really want to make sure that you are prepared to fill the gaps and have an organizational culture where people are learning all the time, giving them flexibility. One of the things that organizations don't do often is to actually prepare a budget for people to have a variety of learning opportunities. So what do I mean by learning opportunities or developmental opportunities? It could be being detailed to another organization to study under someone who has a particular skill for a while, loaning that person out for a month or two. It might be inviting in an intern who has a level of knowledge that they could pass on to other members of your staff. Of course, going off to training, going to college, or doing various kinds of learning opportunities are all things that are there. But based upon your desired future, what you see as your strategic direction, how do you build an interest for both board and staff to move forward and have the skills, knowledge, and abilities to perform those kinds of tasks? So it's really important to be strategic with that. So when you talk about being prepared for the unexpected, Anya, may I have the next slide, please? The lowest threshold for getting prepared to think about succession planning, I think, is the threshold about what if someone wins the lottery tomorrow, or, I prefer not to think about, gets hit by a Mack truck, all right? They may not be back the next day. So who's going to step up and perform that function? Well, the kinds of analysis that you have to do about people's roles and responsibilities in order for somebody to temporarily take on another person's duties is what we call emergency backup succession planning. These are the critical elements of it. And so once you begin to think about a temporary way of making sure that there's enough bench strength that people can back each other up, you don't have to worry about someone unexpectedly getting sick or having to step out unexpectedly. And this is also a great way to be able to afford sabbaticals, because if you have enough backup, people can go out for a while, get refreshed, come back renewed, and have even more energy to do a great job for you. One of the things that you need to do with an emergency backup plan is have a great communication plan. How do you tell your stakeholders, both internal and external, what you're going to do and how you're going to have those functions covered when there's an unexpected absence, and then make sure you refresh your plan annually. And so those are some of the key issues that help with emergency backup planning and gives you a launch into taking a look at more strategic long-term development. All right. The third avenue is one that would probably be a great one, I think, for Tim to talk about, is when you have a planned departure.
Thank you, Karen. Karen just spoke to two types of succession planning, ongoing leadership development and talent development, and then emergency succession planning. And this is what we arbitrarily call a third type, departure defined. It's succession planning that's driven by the fact that a key leader is going to be leaving the organization, usually the executive director, but it makes sense for other top positions, say in finance, in deputy for programs and such. And we recommend that, particularly with a longer-serving executive, this is something that should be undertaken 1 to 2 years in advance of their departure. In the example I gave earlier of a 35-year founder leaving, they should have started 2 years before his departure to really get the organization ready to see him go and a new leader come in and really be able to draw good talent. And it really begins with what I often call a sustainability audit. That's the second point there on the left. Looking at what are our organizational vulnerabilities, what right now needs to be built up so that we are truly a sustainable, viable organization. And what might our vulnerabilities be with the departure of our executive? Often the executive holds, for instance, many of the resource connections with major donors, with civic leaders, with foundations that are supporting the organization. Those relationships, for instance, need to be backed up. The organization will be vulnerable if the leader leaves without backing them up. Is the management team in good shape? And in our emergency succession planning, have we seen that the management team's prepared to step up and fully skilled? It's often a test of their team ability and their leadership abilities. So it looks at, as in the left column here, or the right column, strategy, leadership, management team, resources, systems. What are our current vulnerabilities? What might they be with the departure of the leader? And then what are we going to do to address those vulnerabilities before the leader leaves? It occurs to me that we either do succession planning before the departure or we're doing cleanup after departure. It's sort of post-departure succession planning that is much messier and detrimental to the organization if they're not addressed prior to that departure. So there's a lot more obviously here that could be talked about, but basically it's really looking at if this person leaves, how could we fall? How could we go into decline? And let's address that before that departure occurs. Ruth, can I hand it back to you?
Okay. And I'm basically going to just act as a transition to Vernetta. The job. Did you want to go over these?
Yeah, I should. Yeah, let me cover this quickly. You see in these three columns, and they sort of pull in the elements we've just been talking about. What actions should the organization take now? No one's going to left column here. There's no immediate plan to leave, but it's a good time to be looking at leadership development, at ongoing sustainability planning. Do we have written backup plans in place? All things that should be addressed continually and in an ongoing way by every organization. I always recommend that succession planning in this regard be built into the job description of the executive and other key leaders in the organization. It's an ongoing function. Secondly is what I just described as departure defined. There's a departure going to occur in about 2 years. What do we need to do to get ready for that departure? And then thirdly, less than a year leaving, we really move more closely into what we call executive transition management, sort of the things that need to be done within the last 6 months before a departure. And I think that's been well covered in the previous webinars in this series, in the previous to this one today, I believe. Is that true, Ruth?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep. Okay, so these three, there are three different time frames. One of them, the one on the far left where there's no immediate plan to leave, gives you an enormous amount of time to develop the resilience and the health and the strategic sense of the organization in a way that's really broadly held. The second one gives you a little bit less time, and it's more intentional about covering the transition of a primary leader. And the third is really very focused on covering that transition. So that's the difference between these three. And as Tim said, the best possible thing you can do is to basically be looking at that first category constantly, consistently, and then you move into these more intensive categories later with a lot of the work done. Again, if you've created a culture that is that only accepts one leader or a hierarchical leadership model, and you're suddenly thrown into a situation in which you need other people to step up, it can be enormously destructive to the organization. It can essentially ruin your reputation, which is what we all function on, and your relationships. It can cause questions to be called about the board and the board's ability to handle the organization in general. That's not the kind of thing we want to open ourselves up for. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Vernetta, that is going to talk very specifically about the board's responsibility in succession planning. Vernetta?
Thank you, Ruth. So I'm glad that this webinar is focusing on the role of the board, because we're constantly trying to get boards to do exactly what we say here. Be prepared, be proactive, and be intentional. And in doing these things, there are certain steps that a board can take, and we've listed or provided in the slides, I believe we call it 7 steps for success. And by really, you can come up with a longer list, but we try to make this easy. What I think is important in terms of thinking about the role of the board needs to embrace its role as a leader of the organization. So when we talk about succession planning and being prepared, it's really ensuring that there's some continuity and stability for the organization. And when boards are in that framework or mindset of, hey, we really have a stake in the ground here, we feel some ownership for this organization, we need to ensure the organization's continued viability, that's when they can start connecting the dots with the importance of succession planning. So we've talked about 3 different models. Karen talked about leadership development or talent development and bench strength. I want to go right into our checklist. So number 1, which we have on the screen, is there a climate of mutual trust and respect between the board and chief executive? We focus on this because too often boards are coming in and they're operating at what I would call a surface level instead of really digging in and understanding, simply put, what keeps the CEO awake at night? How is that board, and particularly the board chair, communicating with the CEO? And are communications between the chief executive and the board open, candid, and regular? It's not enough to come in and kind of hover over an organization, receive some reports, because let's say you find yourself in that condition or situation where there was an unexpected departure or something happens. How is the board going to either fill the gap or understand just what next steps are and what needs to be done and what is the status of the organization that they're charged with overseeing and leading with the CEO? So the whole point of bullet or number 1 is ensuring that there is a constructive partnership between the board and the CEO. So that's looking at the communications, the board seeing itself as an ally with the CEO in pursuit of the mission. The one last thing, I thought about this right before we started the webinar as I was thinking about the constructive partnership. Too often I see boards that see their role as being a backup singer instead of part of the main attraction. So there are times when the CEO and the board will share leadership or negotiate who's doing what, but the board definitely is not a backup singer. Number 2, does the board have a current and adequate written job description? And actually I thought that said job description for the CEO, and we also want to make sure that the board regularly, and on an annual basis, reviews the performance of the CEO and the compensation package. When we think about, again, the organization and its stability, the board has to understand what is the actual job of the CEO. And when I say that, for most CEOs that I've encountered, it's more than what you see on that piece of paper that's in the written job description. So what we're talking about here is taking the opportunity to kind of unpack the job of the CEO, because a nonprofit CEO manages so many things. We know relationships, fundraising, and developing the rest of the staff and the day-to-day operations. But does the board really have a sense of what that entails at an appropriate level? Think about it like this. If it was a for-profit corporation, at the end of the day, we would know earnings per share are going to tell us, a little something about productivity, effectiveness, et cetera. And we have a hard time when we think about nonprofit entities of how do we translate performance in the job and what needs to be done and how it's being executed. So spending that time to check in with the CEO, taking a look at the job description and determining, is this still relevant? Do we need to update it? Taking the time to look at the compensation package, because indeed you might have a CEO who's been in place for a number of years, and that CEO gives you notice that he or she is leaving. Can you even afford someone at current market rate to fill that position? And so often boards are, again, caught off guard, or they're in denial, thinking that, this founder has been here, she's worked for peanuts, we can get someone else to work for peanuts. It usually doesn't happen that way, so they need to be vigilant in paying attention to what is the environment that they've created and how are they supporting the CEO in carrying out that job. And unless they're doing that regular check-in, at least annually, and I say at least because I hope that a number of these conversations are going on, that they don't wait until once a year to give feedback or ask what's keeping you awake at night, but at least that provides a certain discipline for a board to get it done. The third item, does the board have a regular and effective process for assessing its own performance? I need to pause here, just let this sink in. Boards spend a lot of time thinking about, we want to assess you and hold you accountable. We need boards to hold themselves accountable. And by engaging in regular self-assessment, and I've got to say, this is becoming widely accepted as a leading practice. We know that it provides the board an opportunity to reflect on how it's contributing to leadership, how it's contributing to setting the strategic direction for the organization, and is their perception of their own performance, or does it meet reality? So when boards have an opportunity to weigh in and kind of gauge where they are or learn what it is that they should be doing, my experience has been that boards will be very candid. Occasionally there's a board that will kind of sugarcoat its performance, but also when you read through a well-crafted self-assessment, you can also pick out those boards too. So taking the time to really step back and reflect, how is this board holding up its end in terms of responsibilities and being accountable, and setting an example by saying, we're not afraid to look at our own performance. That's something that boards should engage in. And the end result is that we see stronger boards that regularly engage in a self-assessment. They're rated higher by their CEOs in terms of their overall effectiveness. We can go to the next slide, please. Adopting a formal succession policy seems like a small thing. What I love about this is that, like we've said, leaders change, whether you're planning for it or not. And at least having a policy to go to will help boards avoid what we call the knee-jerk reaction. Sometimes boards are caught so off guard by having their chief executive leave that the first thing they want to do is just fill the position. And the longer it takes, they feel like that just kind of stretches out whatever anxiety or pain they're feeling. a succession planning means, hey, we've done our work, a little bit of work, and we've put some thought into at least what our initial steps should be and then some steps following that. As I was getting ready for this call, I looked in my files and I found a copy of not just a succession policy, but a succession plan from a previous client. And I think I saved this copy because I was really impressed with the level of thought that they put into their policy/plan, because it's really both. They address the short-term or emergency plan and a more thoughtful plan for a defined departure. And in doing so, they said they recognize that their organization has grown in size and complexity. So it's important for them to make sure that they have a stable management structure. In their emergency succession plan, they have broken down what this board and what other individuals are supposed to do the first 24 hours. They follow that up with within 5 business days. And for every item on here, they have the individual who's responsible. So it covers things like you would imagine in terms of providing notice and making sure they have the names and phone numbers, who's taking responsibility for what. And then when they go into the planned replacement, where they talk about the fact that if it's planned, they want at least 6 months' notice from their chief executive. The fact that they will develop a search committee. They talk about who should and also who should not be on their search committee. Establishing budget requirements for this transition, refining and reviewing the compensation package. And the planned transition has a number of details. Then the third segment of this, which I love, and I don't see that often, is called Change of President/CEO Audit. So they're, and just, part of their planning, being good stewards of the resources, they're thinking, and because this particular organization deals with substantial funds, they said, what if something happens or we suspect something is happening and we need to do an audit? So they talk about things such as verifying all keys assigned, that they're counted and have been collected, changing locks and combinations as necessary. So they're doing a lot of contingency planning here. But and then they have attachments, which includes the names, work numbers, cell numbers, and home numbers of their entire management team, the board of directors, confidentiality agreements, etc. That level of planning, you got to love it, but I also have to admit it's rare. So this notion of being prepared and being intentional, I think that there are a number of boards that have a lot of work to do, but it doesn't require that much. And when you really weigh it in terms of its importance to the stability and continuity of the organization, I don't know how you can not do it. The fifth item on our list, does the board share a collective vision for the organization, how it's going to evolve over the next 3 to 5 years? This is important to have clarity on that, because so often boards will if we're going through a transition or even think if we're confronted with that, boards, I've seen it happen, they will automatically skip to what I would say is the second step in terms of determining who we want to hire or what type of person we need to hire, instead of first determining where we're headed. So let's not forget about step 1, having that clarity around where are we headed as an organization, or as a board, do we have a collective vision for what that looks like, because that's going to help inform you in terms of what is the type of leader that you need to take you there. Number 6, does the work of the board and staff reflect defined institutional directions and goals? This is the opportunity when you're thinking about succession planning and the fact that this work is ongoing in nature, take a look at the organization and do that organizational assessment, your programs, your impact, how you're carrying out the mission. Now, this isn't an exercise that has to be done annually, but if we're talking about succession planning in terms of ensuring the sustainability of the organization, this has to be a part of it. And last but not least, does the board have a clear understanding of the financial condition of the organization? Believe it or not, I've seen boards, I've encountered boards that are so out of touch, they don't know what their chief executive is earning or the pay rate. The chief executive has been setting his salary for years. They receive financial reports but don't understand them, and so they're receiving all of their information perhaps from one person. It might happen to be the CFO. How can we get boards to understand that if they're going to be effective, that they have to understand not just the programmatic side of the organization, but also the financial picture, because that's the only way they're going to be able to make good decisions about the future of the organization. So we have to really ingrain that in boards to understand, again, this is one of your leadership roles. So as we talk about succession planning and executive transitions, there's work for the board to do. It's part of the job. The boards to think that their governance function is just oversight, that's only a fraction of the job of being a director or a trustee of a nonprofit entity. And I think most boards that care about their organizations also care about the future viability and sustainability of that organization. Make this your checklist.
Thank you, Vernetta. That was a lot in a very little bit of time. Can we go to the last slide? And I'm just going to sum up a little bit and then go to some of the questions. I want to go to the culture area, which, as you see, encompasses everything else, and just talk a little bit about some of the elements of culture that are really important to understand in your own organization. One of them, and it's incredibly important, is the degree to which you really see yourselves as a one leader kind of group. Because the more you see yourselves as being directed by one leader, with having the strategy, the reins of the organization really held by one person, the more vulnerable you may be. It's going out of favor at this point, and what's coming into favor is an understanding that you really need everybody in the organization to be taking leadership at some level, so that they're all feeding into the collective strategy making of the organization, the management of the organization. But if your culture really has it's a kind of secretive, self-protective, and not very open in terms of the information that's shared between one body and another of leadership and staff and volunteers, then you're more likely to have some vulnerabilities that if something does happen inadvertently, and sometimes even in a planned way, you'll find some kind of a big leadership hole opening up that swallows up the whole organization. And that's very disturbing. So when a board, for instance, I hear a lot of boards kind of extolling the virtues of their executive directors, and it always makes me very nervous. I don't know how others on this panel feel, because it really does reflect that they are there only to do kind of the bidding of the executive director, and their full faith is planted in them. And in fact, I having been an executive director for decades, I don't want any board, whoever does that, because what if something does happen to me? What if I get sick for an extended period of time? I want that organization to be able to act as if, and be able to carry on as if nothing was amiss. So that the wisdom of the organization, the discernment of the organization, the ability of the organization to see forward has to be embodied in many, many more people than just an executive director, and that should include both members of the board and members of the staff. And that's when you get to kind of that really robust state. But doing that, creating that kind of leadership culture requires that you really do share information, discuss points of strategy, really do dig into the budget and wonder whether if this disappeared, what would happen to that? Where are the leverage points in our system? What's our operating model? And what can we afford to lose versus what do we need to keep in terms of revenue streams? So saying that, again, I want to go to this question of redundancy, because this is a question that has been posed by a number of people in the question and answer section. And one person poses it as this: if you're a very small organization and fairly flat, and you don't have very much money to, for instance, engage a consultant, how do you get to succession planning? What does that involve in the smallest, poorest organization? And I don't know who might want to answer this one.
I'll start, and then I'm sure others can jump in. Just listening to your question, I think one of the things that has to happen is prioritizing succession planning. Just like organizations, and even small organizations, will prioritize strategic planning at some point, prioritize succession planning. And there are lots of templates to help you figure out what needs to be in your succession plan. So just because it's a small organization doesn't mean that it can be ignored. Think about that story that I shared at the beginning. That was a very small organization. Once that executive director left the keys on the desk and left a letter saying, hey, here's where you can find certain things, that board has to figure it out. Would you rather be in that situation or a situation where these are our relationships, these are our grants and our due dates? So we prioritize what's important, and just because it's a small organization doesn't mean that you can leave it to chance or not do it.
Karen, you?
Yes, I agree with Vernetta. And with small organizations, you might say, how can I really dedicate time to this? Well, if you think about how you engage in your performance management opportunities, it's one where you're sitting down and talking about the program, and you invite another member of staff who may have some interest in that field to understand what's going on as well. So there are two people there who are keeping up with a particular project. You'd be surprised. Even the person who is perhaps, way back in the day storing all of the information, who might be your now person who's doing all of your electronic filing, if that person comes up missing, would you be able to retrieve any information? So who else in the organization knows how to get access to the different electronic files that you yourself are not managing? What's a part of that shared pool? So you always need to have a backup person who is thinking about how can I perform that function or complement that person if they are overburdened with other duties, or if they need to take a vacation, or if they're out sick. Who's going to step out to do it? So you can make that type of emergency backup planning the startup. There are wonderful templates. I know that Raffa and Compass Point both have them. I'm sure Tim and I both have templates that are there, along with BoardSource, that can help you think through what are the issues. But a lot of this is just being conscious and intentional about how do I have the conversations to make sure more than one person in the organization knows another person's functions and what's going on, so that we have some bench strength. And that's one of the ways to get into it.
Tim, I want to pose a two-parter to you.
Okay.
One of them really isn't so much about succession planning, but I think the second part of the question is. So the question is, you're talking about all of this as if the leader, in fact, was responsible and competent. And what if your leader leaves or gets ready to leave and there is wreckage all around? What is it that a board should do in that situation? And the second part of the question is, if you want to be able to attract good leadership, what is it that you want those potential leaders to see as they come into the organization, even if it's not perfect?
Great, tough questions. On the first one about lots of wreckage, I regularly recommend, and I've seen it be very effective, that the board consider bringing in an interim executive director, somebody who is skilled in the executive role and skilled in turnaround management. Rather than try to jump into a search and hope to find that savior out there in the field, there are folks readily available to fill the interim role and be the person who's going to come in and clean up a lot of the wreckage. Once the organization is put into good shape with an interim executive, it's got a much better chance of drawing better, talented executives for its future. It sort of relates to your second question. If things are spiffed up, if the finances are put into order, personnel issues have been addressed, if there are underperforming staff that have been dealt with, then it's ready for the new executive to come in and take it into the future. We've often considered the role of the interim executive to take care of problems from the past so that the new permanent executive, can be future focused. So bring in an interim who can really help you clean things up and get ready for a strong future. On the second question, I think a high-performing board is what you want candidates to see. Has the board done its self-assessment? Has it taken care of its own development? Is it fulfilling its role in governance and in being a partner on stage with the executive director? I think that's something that is going to be very attractive to candidates. They want to know that they're going to have a great partner in the board in order to move the organization to ever greater, as we said, mission impact in the community, serving its community. That's what occurs to me, Ruth.
Do either of the other two of you have something to add?
This is Karen. This is Karen. I think, Tim covered it very well. What's the next question?
Yeah. I've got a really good one here that I don't know how to shorten, but this person is asking, what do you do if you have if your organization was started by a founder who stepped out after 2 years and has been around the organization, but the organization's been led for 18 years by somebody else, and then the founder wants to come back into the executive leadership position? Any comments about this?
There's not a vacancy?
Well, go ahead, Tim.
In the standard, and I think there's a very important rule for boards when they're thinking about moving into search and transition. The first thing to do is understand the condition of the organization and where it wants to go and what are the skills it needs to do to get there, to really move it forward, apart from any potential candidates. And if that previous executive founder fits that profile of what they need going into the future, great. But the judgment should be made against a profile of what's needed for the future of the organization, not a legacy for the founder necessarily if they don't have the skills for the future.
Right.
One of the things we've been talking about is ensuring that the board puts in to really develops processes. And those processes are really what will help the board ensure that it's making good decisions about the future of the organization. So those processes would say, hey, if we're at a point where our 18-year executive is leading and the founder wants to step back in, they still have to meet criteria and go through the process. And it's not going to be just based on the relationship. We have to think about what's best for the organization.
And what the right fit is. Mm-hmm. Right. Here's an interesting question. Okay. Sorry. One of our participants asked, how do you avoid in that middle area where we had talked about that you've been given 1 or 2 years of warning that the executive wants to leave? How do you ensure that you do not create a lame duck of the executive during that period when you're building up leadership around that person?
Oh, that's a great question. This is Karen. One of the things I think is important when you have that much time to prepare is that a lot of times when that executive has been present, they are the face of the organization. And you need to develop more faces, if you would. So when that person leaves, oftentimes relationships are diminished because the relationship is with the person, not with the organization. When that executive has chosen to leave, they're going to a particular funder or another key stakeholder, maybe it's government or some other entity. They should be taking another person with them so that the relationship stays with the organization, not just with the personality. Right. So there can be a lot of things that can be done that this person begins to mentor everyone, the board, the staff, on what's the institutional knowledge that needs to be passed on. What are some of the best practices on how to keep a balance of things? Because what we find out, many of the executives are accustomed to balancing 25 or juggling 25 plates in the air. The person coming after them probably doesn't have that capacity immediately. So how then do you allow the organization, those people who are going to be left behind, to pick up, if you would, 20 of those 25 plates, all right, and allow the new leader perhaps to focus in on the most urgent and important issues as they begin to learn and serve the organization appropriately. So a lot can be done by a departing executive to build the capacity of an organization to excel even when they leave. You can consider it a part of their legacy.
Mm-hmm. Either of the other two want to address that question?
Yeah, this is Tim. There's a couple of pieces that occur to me. One, say you're 2 years out, leader, a long-term accomplished leader is going to be leaving in 2 years. You may not communicate the work that you're going to be doing for the first year. You may make the announcement a year into the succession planning work, make it a public announcement at that point, not 2 years out. Secondly, I've found in my work, and I've worked with a lot of this situation frequently, the lame duck fear is overblown. It doesn't really manifest itself. The executive is the executive. They've done a good job, and they're going to continue to have full sway in the organization until they do leave. And more likely, the problem is that sway is going to continue after they leave rather than be diminished. And thirdly, increasingly, I think in the nonprofit sector and among funders, the organization that takes on succession planning is respected for doing so. It's great to model it, that here we are thoughtfully leading into this transition, and it's the right thing to do, it's a good thing to do, and it's to the benefit and to the credit of the organization that they're taking it on, and not be afraid of being public about it.
Yeah. It's like there's only room for one of us in this town. Kind of. Exactly like that. And in fact, any good leader really knows that the more excellent leaders they have around them, the better they look. So that's the way it is. I want to just tell one last story before we go. We're pretty much out of time. I was doing a story the other day for our newswire about this organization where a woman had told her board that she wanted to leave in 3 months, and they kind of apparently paid no attention to her whatsoever. And in the end, it was not only her that left, but the whole management team, because they were so annoyed with the board. So, don't let this be you. It doesn't need to be. This stuff, if you take on, you don't need to call it succession planning necessarily, but have that in your head. Take on sustainability planning so that you're sure that you do have that redundancy, the depth of leadership. You have a full understanding in many areas of the organization about the operating model of the organization, its strategic intentions and its strategic charges for that period of time. It's something that boards should do anyway. It isn't like this is an extra piece of work. But if you understand that, in fact, if you don't do it, you can leave the organization in serious disrepair, it might be an extra impetus for you. It's also something that I think most for the organizations, and there are many of you out there who have older leadership, it's really irresponsible not to begin to take this on as quickly as possible. Because even if they don't intend to leave, they might anyway. So, all right, it's the inevitable thing. So thank you very much for coming. We're going to be sending everybody out a list of readings for the entire series of 4 webinars. We'll also send you links to the other webinars. And thank you very much, Karen and Tim and Vernetta, for a great session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day, everyone.